Today is, in fact, as Adrian just said, really a rather special day for me. I was in China, as he said, during the month of October in 1964. And on the 14th of October, I was traveling by train from Beijing to Nanjing and was put in a compartment. It was an overnight journey with 3 Chinese army officers from the People's Liberation Army. And we got into a conversation, initially very mundane, how many children, who were we married or not, and this sort of thing. And then one of them said to me, well, where are you from? I said, well, from England. He said, now that's where Watt invented the steam engine. Wasn't quite right there, but it was close enough. That's where Watt invented the steam engine. And then you had your Industrial Revolution. Then America had hers, and now we're having ours. Well, 2 days later, when I was in Nanjing, China exploded its first atomic bomb, showing there was quite a bit of truth to this army officer's understanding of the impact of industrial revolutions. Well, I want to fast forward a moment in my introductory remarks. Fast forward over more than 50 visits to China, to a dinner party in Beijing hosted by the former Minister of Science and Technology in China, with whom I had worked quite considerably over about a 10-year period before she became minister. And also the person that Deng Xiaoping had appointed to design and implement the new reform science and technology policies which were supposed to move China from being a command economy to a market economy. And that was in 1984 when that first happened. These and about half a dozen other people who I had known well in China and had worked with over several years invited me to this dinner party. And during the dinner party, we spent the whole evening reminiscing about the changes that had occurred to Chinese science and technology over this 50-year period, almost 50-year period. I would be asked, well, what did I think when I first came in 1964? What did I leave China with? What impressions? Then what impressions when we were involved in some of our SPRU research projects together with Chinese colleagues? What then? And were there many changes in your view? Well, at the end of the evening, all of them said, look, we have not met another foreigner who has monitored the changes in Chinese science and technology over such a long period of time, and we beg you to write what you essentially have said this evening over dinner. We may give some comments to it, and as they had done during the dinner, but we really want you to do it. It was only 6 months ago that I finally did write something, sent it off to them all. They had it almost immediately translated into Chinese, and 2 months ago it was published in the journal The Science of Science in Chinese. So what I want to do today is to draw on these impressions, and I stress the word impressions because as the Chinese hosts at that dinner party had said, we're not wanting an academic presentation, we want your impressions of someone who has been coming over this period of time. And so that's what I'm going to try and do, and pull out from a whole host of different experiences a few of the impressions that I gleaned over this 50 years. I will particularly emphasize the Sussex and SPRU involvement, but to begin, I think I should let you know why it was that I myself became interested in China. As Adrian had said, I was first of all trained as a geophysicist and then had worked with the research labs of the Standard Oil Company of California, in California. After 6 years, I suddenly received a letter from my professor, who I'd studied under in Toronto. I'd gone to Toronto to do my graduate work. He had just come back from visiting all the countries in the world that were doing work for the International Geophysical Year, as he was president of the International Union of Geodesy and Geophysics. And this included a visit to both Chinas. But he was particularly impressed with the Institute of Geophysics at the Academy of Sciences in Beijing. And this in a visit in 1958, just 9 years after Mao had come to power. He was, in fact, quite shocked by how good it was, this research. Came back to Canada and suggested amongst his colleagues that perhaps the time had come to initiate scientific exchanges between China and the West. Say 9 years after Mao came in, it was pretty prescient of him. He managed to raise the funds for a fellowship to enable one of his staff or colleagues, former students, to study Chinese and then at the appropriate time initiate an exchange with the person going to China and doing geophysical research in Beijing in exchange for someone coming from China to Toronto. And the carrot at the end of the stick was that at the end of those 4 years there would be an appointment at the University of Toronto, half-time in geophysics and half-time in Chinese studies. He wrote and said, would I be interested in being the guinea pig? 2 years studying Chinese and 2 years in Beijing. Well, for a variety of reasons, and after consulting with Joseph Needham here in Cambridge, I decided to accept the invitation and began a program of work on Chinese studies, first of all at SOAS in London, and then in the Chinese language school at the University of Hong Kong. And we were about halfway through the second year in Chinese studies when Toronto wrote formally to the Academy, and the Academy turned down the proposal. It wasn't a total surprise. Needham had suggested that that was probably would be the case, but if I had a chance of spending 2 years on the language and studying Chinese history and art and archaeology, then I'd be very foolish not to take that opportunity. And I was very glad that I had, even though it meant I couldn't get into China to do research. But by that time, I had become interested, living in Hong Kong in a society where science and technology were not a priority for the government. I had been invited, because I'd written a number of articles about Hong Kong's science and technology, was invited on to what was the Science Advisory Committee to the governor, and sent as a Hong Kong delegate to the 1963 Geneva Conference of the United Nations, the first major conference on science, technology and development that the UN had convened. And it was that, attending that made me realize that there are a whole lot of issues to do with science and development, not just in China, but throughout the whole of the developing world, that warranted academic study. And so I proposed that the remaining time of my fellowship would be used to let me explore this hypothesis that this was an area that warranted academic study, and spent the next several months wandering around Asia, looking at what each of the countries from Nepal in one extreme to Japan in the other were doing about mobilizing science for their economic and social development. But before I came back to this country, and as it turned out to be, I did have an opportunity of visiting China. This was this visit in 1964, and well, the limitations of a month hosted by the Guoji Luxingshi, the Chinese International Travel Authority, not with any university, but almost everywhere I went, I was able to see the universities, the research institutes, the communes, and anything else I asked for was arranged. The only thing was in Peking. I was only shown the things of tourist interest. But I'm going to go through my impressions at that time because I think it provides a benchmark, almost a benchmark for your whole seminar series, Adrian, because this is what China was like in foreign eyes in 1964. And it is a sort of a benchmark against which we should judge the changes that have occurred since then. The visit was at the height of Mao's influence. It was after the Great Leap Forward and just before the Cultural Revolution. But it was a visit that took place after I had been examining these same sorts of issues of science and development in places like India and Nepal and other Asian countries. So that was the background. Now, what did I find? Well, these, what I can recall today being hit as I traveled around China in 1964. The first one was the extent of the political influence in all institutions visited. You were always met, and the introduction to that institution, the brief introductions, were given by the Communist Party secretary or officials. The head of the institution, who was technically knowledgeable, would answer questions. But that influence was a shock. I'd heard that and understood that it was clearly heavily indoctrinated, but I hadn't realized it was to that extent. Secondly, the emphasis on the word self-reliance. Thought of it in terms of its self-reliance at a national level, where the borders would be basically closed to foreign intervention in any sort, including closed to most foreign technology. But I hadn't realized the extent to which it's spread throughout the country and applied to individual institutions and to individuals. I visited a number of labs, and the government labs that I visited were very similar to those I'd seen in India. They weren't miles ahead, neither were they less well organized and functioning. The technological innovation that I was introduced to, and my words, that word innovation was used frequently on that visit. I was quite surprised. But it was nearly all incremental technical change. And I just want to mention the example of visiting a cotton factory in Shanghai and being told that the workers had made great progress and had innovated, and was shown one machine where the workers had increased productivity by 25 to 30% by increasing the speed of rotation of the cotton spindles, and they had relied heavily on the works of Mao Zedong in bringing about that innovation. Well, I remember replying and saying, well, look, I've read some of Mao's works. I can't recall anywhere in his writing that refers to spinning machine cotton factories. Could you point out exactly in either the Little Red Book or his selected works, what was the section that enabled you to improve the rate of rotation by 25%? Well, they chuckled and said, well, it's not like that. If you read Mao's work carefully, you'll see that a message that comes through over and over again is a little simple motto, which in effect says, if you don't at first succeed, try, and try again. Well, you know, one smiles, and I smiled at the time, but it was a very sensible approach, and eventually the workers did find a way of improving productivity with the old equipment that they had. There was also a story of the peasant scientists which were that I met in the Agricultural Research Institute in Nanjing, who'd been brought in because they had green fingers, basically, and whenever they grew rice, the yields were much higher than any of their neighbors. And the scientists gave them plots of land, told them to produce rice their way. They monitored everything they did, found out why the increase in production was as it was, and then gave them all the credit and had a huge dissemination program with Chen Yung Kong's 3 black and 3 yellow technique of growing rice. But it wasn't nonsense at all. It was a lot of sense to it. I must mention this because in some ways at the time I thought it was one of the most significant things that I came across. And this was the extent to which there were exhibitions and programs trying to inculcate the notion of the scientific method. By combining theory with experiment through mathematics, you could make huge improvements. That's how science occurred. And they were disseminating this, say, through many, many different approaches, and their claim to do that was mainly to show that the peasants and the workers, that there was no such thing as superstition. There were scientific reasons for what they were doing. It's interesting to go back to the time of Francis Bacon and the discussions that occurred in the time of the scientific revolution, which also transformed societies, but I'll leave it. The other thing was on the slogans for disseminating policy. I don't know whether it's still the case, but at that time, the whole policies would be enshrined in just small statements, small slogans, and historically, for those of you who know of Chinese, there was always emphasis given to disseminating ideas through 4-character phrases, 4个字, and these were captured with such things as the self-reliance, 自力更生, read and expert, 4 characters, 有宏有壮, and everyone was expected to be politically correct, but have an expertise, and that expertise to be shared in society. Support the 3 great revolutionary movements, the class struggle, the struggle for production, and the scientific revolution. Again, references to the scientific revolution and science. And it was that, in comparison with what I'd seen for the masses, as you use their word, in India or elsewhere in Asia, there had not been this emphasis on the role of science in bringing about development as one saw in China in 1964. Support the 4 modernizations: industry, agriculture, defense, and science and technology. However, the issue which I think I came away with the strongest impression was the quality of what I was shown in the middle schools and universities that I visited in the natural sciences. I had, a few years earlier, been a tutor in the experimental laboratories at the University of Toronto in physics. And I would say that the second-year program of experiments in the University of Toronto for an undergraduate physics degree was about what I saw in the second years at the University of Fudan and Sun Yat-sen University in Canton. Well, I now come to what happened in SPRU and why did we launch into a study on Chinese science. It was because I came here and joined Jackie Fuller and Chris Freeman in the startup of SPRU in 1966, and I brought with me, of course, my interests on science and development and particularly on China. We eventually got some funds from the Ford Foundation and enabled us to launch a program on China. We initially had a program where we couldn't visit China. It was absolutely still closed with the doors, but we did, as most other academics did who were following China, make use of the foreign language translations of the Chinese language broadcasts and press that was essentially taken in by intelligence agencies but made available to universities. And we got quite a picture of what was happening during the Cultural Revolution from that. But we had these others, technology transfer to the China's offshore oil industry. And some of these others would take too long to go into, and I will just focus a little bit on this particular project. When we established a twinning link with a newly set up institute in the Science and Technology Commission, which was as close to an equivalent of SPRU as you will find at that time, the Chinese National Research Center on Science and Technology for Development. And it was decided that we would engage in a joint research project with Chinese researchers and British ones, looking at an issue which had become of great concern, and I now realize that it was in 1983, I think, was this particular event of this project. China had just agreed, through Deng Xiaoping, that China was going to move to a market economy, was going to open up to the West, and the foreign firms were allowed to join forces and joint venture agreements with the Chinese counterparts. After 2 years, when there had been contracts between the Chinese National Offshore Oil Corporation and the foreign companies, there were several of them, foreign oil companies, there had been contract terms requiring the foreign companies to transfer the technology that they were using in China to the Chinese. After 2 years, the Chinese said that was not happening. They couldn't understand why. It was in the contract. The foreign companies said, we are transferring the technology. We have similar clauses to what we have with other foreign countries and corporations. And no one else has complained. We don't understand why the Chinese are so unhappy. The Chinese Wu Mingyu, who was the head of this institute, thought that this would be a good project where we could have British researchers looking at the supply side, as it were, getting the views of the foreign corporations, but also a team from his own institute. And in fact, we worked together very, very closely. The SPRU's role, as I said, was to work with the Chinese team. We did some work on our own here, and Martin Bell was very much involved in looking at how British drilling companies innovated. What was the process, and were there any lessons from that which might be relevant to the Chinese? But we went around, and there were 2 Chinese and 2 of us, myself and Alison Warhurst from SPRU. We went around all of the foreign subsidiaries and the Chinese subsidiaries of CNOOC And we finally put together, pieced together a story which went along the following lines. We found that, in fact, the two sides, the CNOOC side and the foreign oil companies, had two very different meanings for what the two words technology transfer actually meant. For the foreign oil companies, it meant training the Chinese to do tomorrow with what we do in China today. CNOOC said, yes, we definitely want that, but we also want what's in the black box. What's the secret technology that the oil companies have, which we don't have? And that was why we had this clause about technology transfer. We wanted access to the secret technology. Well, fortunately, I'd worked in Standard of California and had done a study of innovation in that laboratory. And we knew from that, and also our other interviews, that there were a whole host of things which meant that the Chinese had got the wrong end of the stick for this particular issue at that particular time. The oil companies were not using secret technology in China. The oil company staff knew all about how to do an exploration program, but didn't know the details of the secret technology which their head offices had. The secret technology is usually only used in very complex geological situations. Also, the foreign oil companies were cutting back on their own exploration research, and that was being taken up by service companies. And there was no way that China could get hold of that secret technology with a contract with the foreign companies. And so the type of contract they had was not correct if they wanted to get access to, well, whatever secret technology they could persuade the oil companies to provide, even if they weren't using it in China. We put this together in a report. It was widely disseminated. Again, I'm sure Martin will remember going to the Hot Springs Resort near Canton, where after an all-night flight, the two of us were required to talk for the whole of the next day, rather than an interaction. We almost freaked us out. But anyway, that was it. The report was disseminated very widely, diffused both within CNOOC and their joint venture partners. And 2 years later, this was followed up by a study which showed the relations between CNOOC and the foreign oil companies had very much improved, although very little offshore oil had been found in the process. The interesting thing about it was that it was just as the Chinese were moving towards a market economy and opening up, and they still had a lot to learn about how things work in a market economy, how innovations occur. But we think, and it was obvious, that they quickly learned from what we had to do. In '92, I completed my second term as director of SPRU and went as science advisor to Keith Pezanson in Ottawa. He'd just become the president of IDRC. I persuaded him to accept an invitation to go to China. He'd never been to China, and I accompanied him. And the end product of that was that IDRC was invited to put together a team which would look at the impact of the reform policies, the policies to move China towards a market economy. It was 10 years from the time that they invited IDRC to the time that they had initially set up those policies. And they wanted to have a foreign team come in and look and see how well they were doing. And they opened the doors. We interviewed over 300 stakeholders concerned with the generation of new technologies and their implementation. And the Chinese themselves asked specifically that we focus on these 5 things: basic research, high-tech industry, state enterprises, agriculture, and environment. And the review team, they specified, should be experts in one or more of these issues in their own country, and also be from market economies. Now, we came up with a whole series of observations and impressions. And I think one of the ones that we were really most struck with was that how varied it was. We carried out interviews in 6 different provinces. But we found a marked difference between the degree to which the policymakers and implementers in some provinces had grasped the opportunity created by moving to a market economy, and those in other provinces who were very happy with the old command economy and didn't want to make the move and didn't grasp the nettle. And so there were major differences from province to province. A lot of debate about intellectual property. There was an internal brain drain, they said, but the internal brain drain was due to the foreign companies who were setting up R&D labs in China and who were commissioning research on topics that they wanted solved with universities. They were prepared to pay 10 times the usual government salary to get them to come and work for the, and that was 1/10 of the salary they would pay at home, or an international salary. But it meant the creme de la creme of Chinese scientists were moving towards working on foreign designed projects in foreign institutions. And this was a considerable concern to the minister. And we looked into that quite a lot. We had very little mention of the word innovation. Total contrast to my visit in 1964, where lots of comments on innovation. The attitude also towards international science and technology collaboration, all the Chinese we talked with and interviewed thought this was a good thing. And we pointed out in our report that in a market economy, there's often a tension between whether you compete or you collaborate. And the management of that tension was emerging as national strategies for international collaboration in other countries. Well, the minister took up both of these observations and ran with them very hard and set up all kinds of committees and conferences throughout China on a Chinese system of innovation. And all of that was done by the Chinese. She didn't involve any foreigners in that at all. On the question of the attitudes towards international collaboration and the need for a national strategy, she actually asked 2 of us who were on the original team if we would join with 3 Chinese to form a 5-person committee, 2 foreigners and 3 Chinese, to help her design a strategy which in 15 years' time, she said, would put China at the lead, along with all the leading countries in science and technology is concerned. When she put that, 2 of us foreigners on the team, she called for a meeting of all of the heads of departments of the Ministry of Science and Technology, and also the 5 of us as we were about to begin our work. And she said, and in a statement that was not likely to endear her to her own staff, she said, whenever any of you, pointing to the rest of the audience, write me a report about science in China, it's hardly ever that there's anything in those reports that I don't already know. when the foreigners come up with a report, as they did following the review, he said it was full of surprises, things I hadn't thought about which were relevant to Chinese science. And I want this new strategy which we're going to come up with together to be equally full of surprises to me. Well, the contrast between that and the old self-reliance position of what was 30 years earlier was just absolutely remarkable and striking. It was fantastic. Well, I will conclude by saying, and it must have been obvious, how privileged I have been to be able to witness all of these changes at such close quarters, with more than 50 visits and a whole series of projects, and serving on a variety of Chinese committees. And I did want to say this, that much of the involvement has depended on the trust which developed with acquaintances who became friends, and several of whom went on for high positions in the Chinese government. And the importance of developing this trust over a long period of time is something which I hope you'll all remember as you carry on the Sussex tradition of working closely with the Chinese and getting a further understanding of what happens over the next 50 years, but also to maintain that friendship and collegiality. I finish with returning to the dinner party of 2 or 3 years ago. And in that I also asked my Chinese hosts what were the problems that were still on their table as they grappled with Chinese policy. And they came up with these two in particular. There's a real need, they said, and this was 3 years ago, need to strengthen the Chinese innovation system. Many Chinese believe that too many technological innovations depend on foreign firms and foreign technology. There's not enough local input to the yet really Chinese innovations. And the need to improve the Chinese education system, which still emphasizes rote learning and does not encourage creativity. And in fact, I was back again about 2 years ago and spent another evening with the minister, who was now the former minister, and she said that is the #1 problem as she sees it for the future of China.